In the morning of February 16, 2015, a 19-year-old woman checked into a hospital in São Bernardo do Campo, a city right next to São Paulo, suffering from internal bleeding. She would leave the hospital on that same day, in handcuffs, arrested. The young woman had performed an illegal homemade abortion and was reported to the police by her own doctor. To go home and wait for her trial, she had to pay a 1,000 reais bail and faced 3 years in prison. Abortion is a crime in Brazil except in a few cases: rape, when the life of the mother is at risk, and when the fetus doesn't have a brain. That could all change this year thanks to Brazil's Supreme Court. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, and this is Explaining Brazil. The Brazilian Supreme Court starts on Friday, August the 3rd, to hold public hearings with members of civil society around abortions. That's the first step before analyzing a case which could give Brazilian women the right to interrupt unwanted pregnancies until the 12th week. To discuss the case and its possible repercussions, I'm joined today by Carmen Martinez, Regional Manager for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Carmen, it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Gustavo. The Center is so glad to be part of this podcast.
Carmen, Brazil's legislation is quite restrictive when it comes to abortion rights. That's partially due to our macho culture or very religious background. But that's also the case with Argentina and Ireland, and in both of those countries, abortion rights have advanced into granting women more autonomy to decide whether or not they want to keep a pregnancy.
Alegría inmensa, porque las voces nuestras fueron escuchadas, porque pudimos conquistar nuestros derechos, porque el feminismo está más vivo que nunca.
What's keeping Brazil from following that trend?
We think that is happened because you have in Brazil a very conservative government, but also a very conservative Congress and a very conservative court. And that's why the main goal of this case and the hearing especially is that the criminalization of abortion violates many of women's constitutional rights, including the right to dignity, the right to life, equality, freedom. And, for example, if you see countries where abortion is already legalized, like France, for example, this happens that the number of abortions tends to reduce. And this happens because when abortion is treated as a reproductive health need, health services take better care of women without the threat of arrest or a stigma.
Yes, just to illustrate with what you've just said, according to a recent survey called Abortion Worldwide 2017, abortion rates are actually lower in countries which allow abortions, 34 for every 1,000 women, against 37 in more restrictive countries. Has abortion always been so divisive in Brazil? Has it always been this taboo? Because in the U.S., for instance, in the 70s, it was not this cultural war issue as it is right now.
Reproductive rights in general in Brazil is a very complex issue, taking into account not only the current agenda, but also the agenda for the last 2 decades, no? Even when the democracy returns to Brazil.
The Center for Reproductive Rights will be one of the participants of the Supreme Court's public hearings. What will you bring to the court? What will you argue to try to sway the courts towards allowing women to have abortions?
We have accompanied processes like this for almost 3 decades now, and not only in Latin America, like now in Brazil and in Chile last year, but also, for example, recently in Ireland. And the Center will argue that the Brazilian Supreme Court has the power to overturn the penal code and decriminalize abortion in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, we will show that justice, how other courts around the world have made that possible. No? And an example of this is the U.S. Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade, or the C-355 in decision from the Constitutional Court in Colombia. So the court will also hear from us and argue that the court has to follow the world's path that has taken the past 20 years the international law, in which now recognize that abortion is a human right that protects women's life.
But Carmen, you just said that Brazil has a conservative government, a conservative court, Congress, and a conservative Supreme Court. So are you confident that your arguments will be enough to convince the 11 Supreme Court justices?
Well, we think that from the center, not only with the voice of the center, but also the voice of more than 50 organizations, national and international organizations, could be so strong that the Brazilian court could advance the reproductive rights and change the law. No, this will be a really good precedent, not only for Brazil, but also for the region. And we think and we hope that also that is the process that is just happening just right now in Argentina, for example, could be a strong base to take the court to advance these standards.
Brazilian society is still not in favor of decriminalizing abortions. 57% actually believe that women should be punished and go to jail if they perform an abortion. That's actually the lowest rate in recent years, but still a pretty high rate.
We know that abortion, especially in our countries, not only in Brazil, it is a strong word, no? That people relate to an awful procedure, but the reality is that it's a simple procedure in which you can save a woman's life no matter what. And clandestine abortions make up for thousands of deaths per year. So we hope that as the sample of France and even Uruguay, if the court advanced the women's and girls' rights, Brazil could save many lives.
So over the past few years, the Brazilian Supreme Court did promote some change to abortion laws in Brazil. They allowed in 2012 women to abort when the fetus doesn't have a brain. And 2 years ago, a group of justices decided to release from prison a group of doctors who worked in an abortion clinic. Do you think that those two precedents, which are fairly recent, indicate that the court is leaning towards allowing abortions, or do you think that the conservative side is still very strong?
We really hope that the court could advance one step more for the reproductive rights. If you take into account those precedents and also see the changes or the discussion that is recently happened in the South Cone, like for example in Chile, just right now in Argentina, we really hope that this case can allow the court to advance in the liberalization, at least the interruption of pregnancy in the first 12 weeks, and that the court will say that it is a safe procedure, no? This is a thing or an issue that it is about women's health, no? It is an issue of health. And that's why, for example, not only the standards and the most highest international standard from the universal system, the inter-American system, but also in many courts of the world, but also, for example, the World Health Organization recommends that up to 9 weeks pregnancy, medical abortions be performed in the women's homes after adequate medical advice and access to medication in order to guarantee greater privacy. Reliable international studies also show that there is no cause and effect relationship between legal abortion performed in the first trimester of pregnancy.
It's interesting what you say, because in Brazil, the issue is confronted from the moral perspective solely. But just for the listeners to have some figures. So in 2017, only 1,700 legal abortions were performed in Brazil. But at the same time, in terms of surgeries performed by the public healthcare system to correct complications of illegal abortions, they amount to almost 180,000. So that shows a bit how many women are not being covered by proper medicine to perform abortions. Some take medicines that can be really risky for their health. Some go through very unrecommended medical procedures. But in Brazil, that has been hard to convince people to talk from the healthcare perspective. How do you think we could do that in Brazil? Because we're about to head into a very divisive presidential campaign in October. And abortion over the past few years have become a central cultural war issue in political campaigns. How can we escape this pitfall and seriously talk about abortions?
That happens not only in Brazil. Now, if you see, for example, the last presidential election in Costa Rica, it was the same discussion, no? And also here in Colombia was elected a new president, and the discussion it was all about that. From the center, we think that the change of paradigm happens when you talk about this issue, abortion, with a framework, with a legal framework, with an approach of human rights, but especially when you transform the conversation or the discussion in terms of public health. This is a public health issue. We are talking about women's life. We are talking about the health of women, and especially when you talk about that terrible data, like almost 180,000 abortions. Imagine how much the health system has to invest to resolve complications from illegal abortions, and how many years of healthy life we lose each year due to those complications. That we need health system in which a woman can walk to a clinic, really walk to a clinic, not have a plane or a train or a bus for hours, and get an abortion from a certified doctor. This is a health problem.
Let's not kid ourselves, because it's a problem that also affects mostly poor women, because rich women can travel abroad to have their abortions, or they can get to very expensive, even if clandestine clinics. So deaths from illegal abortions are mainly to poor, black, uneducated women. And in Brazil in 2016, Brazil experienced a very serious outbreak of the Zika virus, a virus that is connected to severe birth defects like microcephaly, and that caused a decrease in the number of births. 2 years later, can we analyze the impact of this epidemic in Brazil and maybe in other Latin American countries as well?
We especially regarding to Zika, we elaborate a report in 3 countries of Latin America with the Harvard School, Public Health School, and a department of researcher specializing in health from the Yale University on how the Zika virus impacted many lives. No? And for example, a transversal conclusion was that the Zika virus shows how these countries, Colombia, El Salvador, and Brazil, wasn't prepared in terms of access and guarantee of the reproductive rights and reproductive health, sexual and reproductive health. Even, for example, in Colombia and in Brazil, when we have exceptions, several exceptions or some exceptions that allows women and girls to access to legal and safe abortions. Even in this context, the women and girls confront many barriers to access to reproductive health. And for example, it happens in Brazil and also in Colombia that we interviewed around 5 women affected or infected with the virus, with the Zika virus, when they was pregnant. And for example, no one of them access to reproductive and sexual health education. They never find information of how to avoid pregnancy in the times of the Zika virus or in the times of the crisis of Zika. It is still an epidemic. No, even that the World Health Organization calls for the end of the epidemic, it is still an epidemic that affects the women and girls' bodies, no, and the women's and girls' health. And of course, it is worse in El Salvador when we have a total ban on abortion, where even women and girls that tries to access to abortion are criminalized about that.
Carmen, I wanted to thank you for joining us for this podcast. Thank you for your time.
Thanks to you.
If you like this podcast, please take a look at our website. It's Brazilian.report. Every day we have new content about Brazil's politics, economics, and society. We also have exclusive newsletter services if you want to be briefed on what's going on in Brazil before starting your day. Subscribe now to our free trial and enjoy all of our content for 14 days. It's really for free and you don't have to put any credit card information. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle is @Brazilian Report. That's all for now. See you next week.